Reclaim is a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter, with your host, Thais Sky. Together, we will explore the questions of what does it look like to reclaim our sovereignty, our worthiness, our voices as women in this messy world. No topics are barred as we offer roundtable discussions on life, spirituality, politics, and what it means to be a woman in the modern age. Let's do this. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the party. Ooh, I'm partying in my closet. Woo! Yes, I'm here in my closet. It is Monday. This podcast episode is going to go live tomorrow when it will be Tuesday. And I have a really amazing guest for you. Andi Grace is here with us. Andi is going to share a lot of thoughts on grief. Stay tuned for that in just a few minutes because the interview is not to be missed. But before I get to the interview, I have a couple things that I want to share. First, an announcement. Last week, I shared with my community a 40-page workbook that I've called Worthy Women Rise Year in Review. It includes rituals, ceremonies, and over 50 journal prompts to support you in closing the energy of your 2017 before you start planning and getting excited about your 2018. So far, I've had over 200 people download my workbook, which is really exciting, and it's available for a while longer. It's free, it's glorious, and I highly recommend you get it if you're looking for some support around closing out your year. I mean, how often do we really spend sitting with and completing our past year before we just set our vision in the new year and how we're going to create these New Year's resolutions that are going to blow everything away? I mean, how has that worked for you last year or the year before last, right? For me personally, it doesn't work very well. And so what I've done is I've created this workbook to support me, answer some questions and get into the right space of all that I have achieved and all that I have become, all that I've learned, all that I have understood of the past year before I start goal setting and planning and looking into my new year. If you want access to Worthy Women Rise Year in Review, you can go to the show notes or you can just go to my website, thaissky.com/year. That's YEAR. So thaissky.com/year. Or you can go to my show notes and download your free copy of Worthy Women Rise Year in Review. I know that it has impacted a lot of people already. They have really enjoyed it, and I hope that you enjoy it as well. Now, I've been thinking a lot about grief, given the current state of our world, given all that has transpired in 2017, given how the astrological energies are affecting us at this time. I think many of us are thinking about grief. And I wrote something to my community that I did not put as a blog post. So if you aren't on my list, you didn't get it. But I want to read it to you now because I think it's really important. And let's just do it. I'm just going to read it. Okay? Get ready. I want you to sit down, close your eyes, and allow my beautiful wisdom to just pour into your ear. Okay. Seriously. Let's go. If you listened to my podcast last week, you know that I shared in the intro that my new awareness of the true meaning of Thanksgiving was inviting me to infuse even more mindfulness into how I celebrate one of my favorite times of the year. So I took some time to unplug, and in the space I cultivated, I've been noodling on the realization that this time of the year elicits a lot of expectation, primarily to be merry and bright, at the expense of our worthiness. More than ever, it seems. I say more than ever because after the shitstorm that has been this year, I know so many of us are looking for recluse under the umbrella of holiday cheer. Maybe, just maybe, we can drink enough eggnog to fall into stupor that momentarily blocks all memories of Trump being elected. Maybe. By the same token, this time of the year can bring up a lot of difficult emotions. It seems to me like whatever we didn't fully process earlier in the year, grief, loss, fear, panic, inadequacies, comes bulldozing into our lives, demanding burning attention. It has always been a curious thing listening to Christmas music for me. Underneath the catchy tunes and happy lyrics, I tend to feel a twinge of sadness. What is that? Is that just me? As I was saying, it is undeniable that inherent in the holiday season is the insidious expectation to live up to a narrative that literally no one can uphold. You know the one, the happy family with the perfect decorations and an idyllic house with the snow and the adorable children. So here we are with the darkening of the days. Human psychology tells us we have a deep fear of slowing down and being in the dark. Feeling the weight of the year coming to an end without all of our goals coming to fruition, and the deep shame of imperfection. What do? Well, we do what we've been conditioned to do, of course. We dive into the holiday spirit with vengeance. Now, that's unless you're one of those who completely push away anything holiday related, probably for the reasons I've shared here, in which case I hear you. And check in with yourself regardless, okay? This time of the year is rough, even without contending the holiday madness. And what is the holiday spirit if it's not pouring time, energy, and resources into buying and eating? Am I right? This country spends an exorbitant amount of money on gifts this time of the year and are encouraged to eat every step of the way. Here is just one statistic. Americans spent an average of $800 on gifts during the 2016 holiday season, totaling to over $1 trillion. That is insane. Actually, no, that's not what's insane. What is insane is that we are no better people for it. Or should I say, we're not happier for it. So why are we encouraged to eat and spend so much? I think it's pretty safe to say capitalism. People who feel worthless buy things. So the better question is, what state of mind do we have to be in to willingly fall into the false narrative that these things will make us fulfilled, that buying these things will ultimately grant us entrance to the holy grail of happiness? What I know to be true for me is that when I go into the spirals of binge eating and binge spending, I am in the throes of emotional overwhelm. Emotional overwhelm is one of the key conditions of the worthiness wound. And one of the ways we avoid the worthiness wound is by staying busy and distracted, which only keeps our pain running the show. So here's my high-level analysis on the shadow of the holiday season condensed into one sentence. Our emotionally illiterate culture is addicted to the holidays like crack, hoping it will take the edge off of our fears of slowing down and being in the dark, but really perpetuating our inability to navigate the realness of being human. Recently, I shared this on Facebook. Being human fucking sucks sometimes. When I gave myself permission to really internalize this understanding, to break down the facade that I had to be happy and high-vibing and positive all the time, when I surrendered to the fact I didn't always have control, that just because something shitty was happening didn't mean I attracted it, that at the end of the day, being human just fucking sucks sometimes, I experienced so much relief. Resisting the reality of life, I found, is a huge energy suck. Embracing that suffering is allowed to exist alongside the good and yummy in the world offered me the ability to then explore what choices I did have, to lean into acceptance, and to deny myself nothing. Okay, so let's apply that here. How could we embrace where we are and who we are, including the real challenges we experience, the real letdown of our lives, the pain that is humanness, so that the holiday cheer could add to our lives instead of suck our souls? In that light, holiday blues are really a misnomer. It should be named what culture thinks you should be sad about, but is not really yours because there's nothing wrong with you for leading a life outside of a Christmas song, and now that you know this, you can find freedom in your heart again. Too long? Our lives are complex. Being human can be terrifyingly lovely. You are so enough. Which is why it's so clear to me that breaking free from the shackles of the internalized beliefs from our culture is key to our worthiness. I believe if we can learn how to be with our complex lives, we can enjoy the merriness of the holidays without allowing it to define our worth, without it consuming our bank accounts and our waistlines, without taking away our dignity and happiness, without it just being another thing on a to-do list. Because these final fluttering days of the years can truly be the most wonderful time of the year in whatever way you celebrate. And damn it, Trump can't take away this too. But it's going to require some untangling. You with me? I have many more thoughts on this, but I will end it with this. Your wild soul will never fit a one-liner from A Christmas Carol, and you are so much better for it. To your worth, Thais. Whew, that's quite a doozy, and I shared a lot there. If you want to know what I'm talking about when I'm speaking of the worthiness wound, you're welcome to go to my website. I have so much information on the worthiness wound. This is a model that I've created on how worthiness lands in our hearts, like what does unworthiness mean and how we can start to separate ourselves from feelings of unworthiness. So if you want to learn more about that, go to my website, thaissky.com, and you can learn all about it. Okay, I've given you a lot to think about. Let me read to you Andi's bio and then bring Andi into the conversation. So Andi Grace is the Empress Hermit Witch of the Witch Cabinet, an online quadrant for radical femme magic. They're a genderqueer trauma survivor, herbalist, author, kitchen witch, and feelings top who loves red lipstick, pole dancing, and swimming in lakes and rivers. Andi jumped into their work with the Witch Cabinet full-time 2 years ago. Through the Witch Cabinet, Andi published the wildly popular e-zine We Believe You, Femmes Surviving Toxic Masculinity, and Soother, Femmes Grieving Family and Fertility. Andi also teaches a 12-week online class, Hawthorne Heart, Boundary Skills and Protection Magic for Femmes, Witches, and Healers. Their work is radical, heart-open, fiercely accountable, tender, and bold. Andi lives on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. You can find their work at witchcabinet.com, and you can also go to our show notes for more of Andi. So Andi reached out to me, and I've connected with their work online, and one of their articles that they wrote, I'm actually going to share in the show notes next week about cultural appropriation and yoga, so stay tuned for that. But I love Andi's heart. I love how Andi shares their thoughts on grief. I love how vulnerable Andi gets, and I hope that you really, really enjoy this conversation. And as you're sitting with the things that Andi shares, I want you to think about, what is your relationship with grief? What have you not grieved? What is your transition experience has been like? And what are you committed to doing to really allow yourself to grieve moving forward? Hello, Andi. Welcome to Reclaim.
Hi.
Hi. Today, there's so many things that we can talk about for the conversations that we had before I clicked record. But let's begin on the conversation of grief and reclaiming grief and what that journey has been like for you. So share a little bit about what you shared with me about how special today is, and then we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, so today, it's interesting too, because I think it's not just an anniversary for me. Like, I run a Facebook page for my online class, Hawthorne Heart, and multiple people are posting about in and around this time, kind of trauma anniversaries or grief anniversaries. I think it maybe has something to do with Scorpio season. But today is the 1-year anniversary of me leaving a relationship that I cared about very, very much, but that was very dysfunctional. And I have never in my life experienced so much grief. And I sort of framed it for myself as taking a grief year. The territory that I was living on, unceded Sinixt territory, has this practice where when you lose a loved one or you experience like a really big loss, you don't harvest any plants for a year. And there's other things that go in line with that protocol too, but because I had lived on that territory and because so much of my life had involved around wildcrafting, I decided that I wasn't going to harvest for a year. And I also shaved my head and I did magic with my hair. And I really just like dove super hard into the action and the art of grieving.
The art of grieving.
Yeah, which is a phrase that I think came out of some counseling sessions that I did with my counselor, whose name is Rain Crow. She's amazing. I love her very much. And she was just talking about how, grieving, so much of our culture, we frame grief as a feeling. But grief is also a verb. Like to grieve is a verb. It's an action, right? So I think that there's the feeling of grief and the sort of the state of grief, but there's also the action. And I think that we can become skillful and artful in the way that we grieve. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of models for how to do that. But I think that, especially for people who are starting to come into witchcraft and magic now, I think that we're starting to reclaim and recreate models for how we can grieve in good ways and in full ways and in richer ways than our culture really provides for us now.
Yeah. My partner is Jewish, and he lost a family member that he loved very much last year. And in the Jewish tradition, you, as the intimate family member that, is grieving, you're not allowed to do anything. You are not allowed to clean your house. You're not allowed to cook. You are literally not allowed to do anything. And community comes in and takes care of you for a set number of days. And I feel like that is so beautiful, that there are so many traditions that honor that we can't just be expected to operate as everything is normal after we experience grief.
Yeah. And my understanding, which I want to acknowledge is limited as a settler person of the Sinaiacs protocol, is that it works in a similar way, in the sense that there is a system, or there was a system. I think both of those things are true. There is and was a system in place wherein a head woman in a position of leadership is collecting herbs and food and things to support the grieving people and things to support the community, and that those things are redistributed so that if you are in a period of grief, your needs are met by other people. And I think that why that is done, not speaking to like the Sinaiacs tradition specifically, because I don't know in the Sinaiacs tradition specifically, but I imagine that in the practices where that is done in general, because I think it's a common thing to sort of be like, you are just grieving now, is because grief is both a deeply transcendent and simultaneously embodied state at the same time. It's like we're in our bodies, but we're also in this moment where it feels like time doesn't exist in the same way, having a body doesn't exist in the same way, reality doesn't exist in the same way. And I think that there's something, our culture is so bereft of models for grief that we end up being in grief, but expected to still do things like go to work.
Yes.
And feed ourselves.
Yeah.
And I know, like, for me as a person who loves to cook, like, one of the things I will say that I'm also reclaiming is eating, because I could barely cook this whole year. It was really, really, really hard. And I curated a zine. Part of what my business does is I curate digital zines, which are basically like ebooks but they're not really a book in the sense that I think there's something that harkens, like a zine harkens to a certain type of culture wherein there's this idea of self-publishing something that maybe isn't acceptable to a mainstream publishing house, but still has value. And so I created this digital zine called Soother, because part of what I was grieving this year was that I helped bring a baby into the world, was supporting a partner who was pregnant, and never ended up meeting that baby in person. And it was a really complicated thing, because it's really, there were certain narratives within talking about miscarriage that found pieces that applied to my experience, but I hadn't actually been pregnant, so it didn't really feel quite mine. And there were certain narratives around sort of like divorce and families falling apart and fathers being alienated from their kids in various different ways that felt relevant to what I was experiencing, but I'm not a man. And so I created this zine that was a space for people to tell those kinds of stories that didn't have spaces that fit anywhere else. So there's stories about abortion. There's a story sort of what happened to me. It's a really beautiful zine.
Why do you think that it is so hard for us to grieve in our society?
I think that a lot of our society, a lot of the values of our society are premised on ideas that we can produce that we don't have any limits to how much we can produce within capitalism. Like the way that capitalism functions in the current moment, and the way that colonization also functions, is this idea that there is no end to what you can colonize. There is no end to what the market can produce, and so I think that value gets reflected in our bodies. And in order for us to participate in capitalism, grief doesn't fit in a mode of endless production. Like if we were to grieve, we would be grieving more deeply if you were to take a moment to grieve the state of the planet, which is in a process of extreme transformation, which is going to result in more death than it already has, more death and trauma and pain. If we were to all be grieving that by stopping what we're doing, and like capitalism would stop, it wouldn't function, right? So I think that grief and that sort of embodied transcendent state of grieving is antithetical to the system that we live in. And I think that it's part and parcel with the dehumanization that is required for us to show up for business as usual. And so in that sense, I think grieving is actually a very radical practice, like really acknowledging. And that's part of why I shaved my head, was because I felt like I was experiencing this tremendous grief, and I wanted it to be visible from the outside that I was a different person, like a drastically different person.
Oh, I feel like there's so much that you just said right there in such a short amount of time that we can spend hours dissecting. But I do want to get real quick into your experience of grief. And for you in this year of grief, what was the hardest part for you?
I lost so much. Like I cut off relationships with family. Both like chosen and blood family. I lost relationships with friends. I lost my housing security, lost my gardens, lost my goats, lost this baby that I had a lot of kind of invested a lot of myself in. I think, and the only reason I'm listing that is to kind of contextualize how much what I'm about to tell you meant to me, which is that in moments I really lost hope. And I think that was the hardest part for me, because like I went to school for women's studies, and women's studies is very much like critique this, problematize this, like all the prompts start with those kinds of language. So
I have no idea what you're talking about, Andi. That does not seem at all like what the
yeah. And so I think, one of the things that can happen is people, they talk about like the killjoy feminist. And I think I get perceived that way a lot because I can be a very critical person. But as a person who is a many times over Sagittarius, I am also like, in my heart of hearts, I am a relentless optimist. And to a point that it's actually like kind of problematic sometimes, because I can sometimes not, even though I'm a very like, I think, I do a lot of work in shadow, and I think it's because it's an antidote to this optimism that I have, or not an antidote, but a balancing force to this optimism that I have. And so I think, and I have a Leo moon. So in my heart of hearts, I'm actually deeply loyal, even though a lot of people don't perceive me to be that way, because I'm a very boundaried person. But I tend to set boundaries and then really ache in how much I miss being sort of loyally caught up with another person. And so for me to be in a place of losing hope, and I've gone through waves of losing hope before, but I lost hope in a much deeper way, to the extent that I was somewhere on the suicidality spectrum for pretty much the entire year that I was grieving. And it ranged how deep I went into that spectrum. But it was always there, sort of hanging around. And so I think it was a really, losing hope was, and grieving so that I could have a more realistic sense of hope, I think was a really transformative process for me, and one that I'm still in, but it's also one that just feels like really tender and painful. And it makes me unsure about how I want to relate to other people in terms of building relationships, because I want to be able to see people clearly, and I want to have an appropriate amount of hope based on how that person is in the world. And I don't want that to turn into judgment, but I also don't want to have, I don't want to place hope in people where that hope will be dashed and I will be hurt, because having hope feels like a very, very tender, vulnerable thing for me now.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, so, I feel so many of us are afraid of grief and afraid of sadness because the fear is that they're going to be that way forever.
Yeah, totally.
That you're going to be sad forever, you're going to be grieving forever, and then it feels almost like wallowing, and then it feels almost like you're spiraling into a deep place. So I'm curious what that experience was like for you, of how did you make sure that you were giving yourself the proper amount of time to move through this grief without pressure, while also not wallowing and sitting in the shit, and you know what I mean, like, and surrounding yourself with shit and be like, I'm just gonna be sitting in the shit and feeling sorry for ourselves, etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah. What I will say is that I don't feel that I have fully grieved what happened to me. I used a lot of different tools to not fully go there. And then as I say that, there were moments where I did. So it was a balance for me in the sense that, I have a few thoughts. One is that I actually think it's really important in a boundary way to let yourself wallow. My partner calls that broken phase, where you've had like a trauma or a grief and you feel broken by it, and that it's actually really important to just like be in that broken phase where you're just like, I'm just broken right now.
Yeah.
And in that broken phase there, I think what's really important is, for me, one of the skills I use to welcome that phase is I grant myself permission to do things I wouldn't normally do. So one of the things that I did when I was really struggling to eat is I ate at McDonald's every day because it was cheap and it was easy and it was kind of empty calories but I couldn't eat. Like, I was just like, I didn't want to eat. And I was like, I need to eat something, and cooking makes me cry. And so I'm just going to eat McDonald's. And I never would normally do that for a number of reasons. And I'm not shaming people for eating McDonald's. It's like, whatever. I just feel like we live in a capitalist system. There's a limited amount that we can do via consumer choice. I like to cook and I like to make food. It's an expression of love for me. And I just couldn't do it. That part of me was just broken. So I think and I let myself like lean into drugs and alcohol more than I normally would. And I let myself stay in bed all day. Like, I stayed in bed for like 3 weeks at one point. And I let myself have this sort of broken phase that acknowledged how broken I felt. But I tried to do that in balance with other things. So, the one thing that I didn't step fully away from, I stepped away almost from almost all my relationships because I was like, yo, I actually just don't have anything to give anyone right now. So set a lot of boundaries in my relationships, and I was like, I will step back into intimacy with you later. I will provide emotional labor for you later, but right now I need to have my broken phase. The one thing that I didn't let slip was my business. And the reason for that is that my business is tied to my creative practice, and a lot of how I touched into the deep grief was through magic and writing, which are both really woven into my business. So Soother was something that I created that really worked around that grief and really allowed me to touch in on it. And the piece that I wrote in Soother is like deeply, deeply personal and really hard to write. And it was not a blog post. It was a collection of vignettes of moments that I had in this relationship that I had left behind, and moments after that kind of contextualized some of my magic. And I did a lot of magic. Like I cut off my hair and I put it in a nest that my ex had given me, a bird's nest. And I stuffed all my hair into the nest, and I burnt the hair and I burnt the nest, and I collected the ashes and I blew them out of my hands into the ocean. And it was funny because I did things like that throughout the year, but it just felt endless. Like it just felt like no matter how much I touched into it, it does feel like it's going to swallow you. And I think it actually, and it feels overwhelming. And so I think that there actually is value to, there's value to giving yourself the moments to feel broken. There's value to just crying, just like collapsing into tears. Like this whole year, if I watch a YouTube video of something that is like moving, like I'll just start bawling. And it's like, I don't actually really feel moved to tears by this like cat who did a cute thing. Like I just, it's coming out in whatever ways it's coming out, and not shaming that and allowing that to just come. But I think it is okay to have a broken phase, and it's okay to not try to address it all at once, because that's why so many of these practices are like, like a year and a day is a big one in the sort of like witch magic community, right? And my year and a day is tomorrow, and I can already feel the energy kind of shifting. And I gave it the space that it deserved, because that relationship deserved to be honored.
Yeah.
It was fucked up in a lot of ways, but it was beautiful in a lot of ways too. And it deserved to be honored. And I think I did that.
Yeah.
And we'll continue to do that.
I wish I knew this when I was younger. Now I look back at some of my past relationships and friendships, and there's still so much lingering sadness there because I never gave it the space necessary to grieve. And I feel like in our culture, certain things are acceptable to grieve and certain things aren't. And because they aren't acceptable, we're like a breakup, like a relationship, like just fucking move on. It wasn't divorce, it wasn't a family, right? But it felt like it, and it can be it. And just because you didn't have a formal contract in place doesn't mean it doesn't impact the individual to the extent that possibly a marriage would. And so I just wish that I would have known when I was younger that grieving is honoring, and that it is imperative to really letting go and moving forward.
It is. And I think it's interesting, your example about marriage, because it is very much sort of police what is acceptable grieving. And then in that, because to grieve, we need to acknowledge that we have lost something of meaning.
Yes.
And if, the marriage one is particularly interesting because, like, for me as a queer person, like, I live in Canada, so I can get married. And I have hesitations around the idea that gay marriage is like the be all end all issue. I think it's an issue that is easy to rally around, but I don't think it's actually the most fundamentally important issue in our community. But in places where it doesn't exist, what that implies is that if we can only grieve a marriage and a breakup isn't sort of seen as acceptable in the same way, then what does that mean about how we see gay and queer relationships? That if we can't grieve it, then we can't acknowledge that it had meaning in the first place, which is just an extension of sort of homophobia and all of those systems. And I think that grieving also, like, I wrote a piece, so I teach an online class called Hawthorne Heart, which is a class on boundaries. It's a class that teaches practical skills and magic, protection magic, and it's geared towards femmes, witches, and healers. And one of the fundamental sort of tools that I teach in that class is, or ideas that I teach in that class, is that grief is necessary to set boundaries. And I share actually an excerpt from that lesson on my Little Red Tarot column. I think it's titled, "I'm Scared to Be Alone on Grief and Boundaries." And it's basically about how people get really scared to set boundaries because they are really afraid of the consequence on the other side. Yes. And I think that in order to set a boundary, which can involve, whatever, saying no to something in some way or shape or form, we actually need to grieve what it is that is not going to happen as a result of the boundary. And to grieve something, we have to be able to acknowledge it fully. So I think grief is necessary, not only for us to be able to move through transitions and loss in sort of whole, intact ways, but also necessary for us to be able to have the life we want. Because when we decide to do something, we have to decide to not do a bunch of other things, and we have to be able to grieve all of those things. And not being able to grieve those things can leave us feeling spread really thin and feeling really boundaryless. And so I think that grief is such an integral part in healing, not just around loss, but also because it is necessary to get to where we want to be.
Yes. And I also think that we need to insert grief more often when we are saying yes to something new, to grieve for the old life that's passing by. Entering a new relationship is an example. When you're entering into a new relationship, it's so exciting. But there's also a loss there. There's a loss of your, in a sense, independence. There is a loss in your lifestyle before this person came into your life. Other examples are when you're going into school. Let's say you're going to college. You're going to
totally.
There's a grief of your childhood. When I moved to California, from Maryland, my family lives in Maryland. And while I had moved to Boston, I'd moved to Jersey, this move to LA felt like a movement into radical adulthood. And I had the sense that I was never going to be moving back. I had a sense that this is it. Not that I'm going to be in LA forever, but that I am not moving back to Maryland ever again. That is not in the realm of possibility. And one of the things that I had to grieve, and that sometimes I still find myself grieving, is that whenever I think of home and I miss home, I realize I'm never actually going to feel like that is home again.
That's a huge thing to grieve.
Yeah. And no one talks about that. No one told me that, Andi. No one was like, hey, by the way, adulthood is littered with loss and grief over things. You were so excited. You were so excited to go to college. You're so excited for your first job. You're so excited for all these things that you don't recognize yet that you're also having to do a lot of loss and a lot of grief of that loss.
Well, and it's a type of gaslighting in the sense that where I see it really particularly, especially in the sort of like, my work sits on this weird fence sitting place of like, has some sort of like new age qualities to it and like obviously a lot of magical witchy qualities to it, and some sort of overlaps with coaching community and whatever. And I think one of the things that happens in a lot of sort of new age spaces that really don't want to look at shadow is this idea of sort of gratitude and like have a positive outlook and look at the silver lining. And in a way that there is very much, and I will say that I think gratitude is a really important practice, particularly when we're reflecting on things like our privileges and when we're trying to step into our right-sized power and to being able to like be accountable for the power and privilege that we do have. I think gratitude is a super, super important practice. And I think that mandatory gratitude, especially in times of trauma and in times of grief, I've talked about this so much with my partner. He's really helped me because he very much, I'm a doer when things don't feel good, and he is like he does things, but he's a many times over water sign. So he's like, I'm just gonna feel this. And like, even just being near him, he's feeling, I'm like, oh my God, just, I was like, must do something. Like, it's really, it's, you know, and I noticed that it's hard for me to just like sit in the feelings. Right. And I think that there is a certain kind of gaslighting that happens when it's like, you know, you're like, I'm really sad that I'm leaving home. And the typical response is, but aren't you so excited
Yes.
about where you're going? And I think it's a subtle gaslighting, you know, it's not like and it's not even meant to be hurtful. What it is that it's a diversion away from sitting in an uncomfortable feeling, because there's a vulnerability and an intimacy to just sitting with someone and not trying to fix it and just acknowledging that that's real. And it goes to this place of like, I think at the root of it, it just makes us all think about loss, and it makes us think about dying, and it makes us think about all these things, and we're just like, whoa, that's too big. Mm-hmm. Like, you want a cookie? Here's a silver lining, you know? Like, we just want to like put it in this little box. And the grief can't move in the little box. It can't breathe, but it's still there, like, and it will just pop up in other ways.
Yeah. And you know, my practice and my continual practice is to hold both. You can hold the excitement of this new adventure, you know, and you can hold the grief and the loss and the sadness of what you're putting behind you. You can have both. One does not have to be better or bigger or sexier than the other. They can both be true, and they can both be true at the same time. Mm-hmm. And when we can start to hold these different various parts of ourselves and the different reactions and the different emotions, we actually then cultivate that container for ourselves where we don't push anything away. And I feel like that is when we can allow life to move through us, instead of, like you said, getting it stuck in these containers. Mm-hmm. And then when we don't process the grief, it stays with us for a very long time.
It comes up in other ways.
Yes.
That are harder to identify.
Exactly.
And I think it's been interesting for me. So like this year, there was overlap in the relationship that I'm in now with the relationship that I was in previously. And like we were in a polyamorous dynamic, so there wasn't cheating, but I think that my ex felt, from their perspective, I think that they felt like there was betrayal. And I think that there are ways that is true. I think that there are ways that I betrayed them and things I owe them apologies for. And what was interesting for me is that I was in this situation with my new partner wherein I felt it was the weirdest thing, because I was falling in love with them in a way I had never fallen in love with another person. And I was simultaneously having a totally insurmountable amount of grief about the love I had had with my previous partner, which was extremely significant to me.
Yeah.
Because up until that time, that previous relationship had been the most deeply I had ever fallen in love with someone. And it was really, really complicated, because I would find that every time I would lean into the feeling of really connecting to the sensation of in my body being in a connection of a moment of love with my partner, it made me feel like I wanted to die. Like, it made me feel like I was dying, because a part of me was in so much grief that the grief and the new feeling of love was completely inextractable from each other. And what was really interesting about that is that I think in my younger years, I think I have used, and this is like, I'm not like, this is my own feelings about myself, though I have like perceived this as something that can happen within polyamory, is that if we don't have process and we don't have sort of grief allowed for one thing to transition into another thing, I think we can kind of just attempt to skip the grieving in favor of new relationship feelings. And I think what was interesting for me about this situation is that like it was literally impossible for me to do that. And I had moments of being like, should I even be in this relationship if like if I'm experiencing this tremendous amount of grief. And what I realized was that I ended up kind of coming to this place of being like, it's okay for me to be feeling feelings of love and also feelings of needing this person. Like I needed their help because I was really not okay and I needed their support. But also to just be really honest that like my capacity to love them is like wounded because it's being taken up by processing all of these other feelings. And I would have moments of like being in a bath with my partner and be reading a poem that reminded me of my ex and like brought me to tears. And it was so interesting to be like, I'm feeling this so intense, huge heartbreak about missing this person and missing everything that our life used to be. And also simultaneously being held in this like really tender way by this new person and not feeling like there needed to be a disconnection or differentiation between those moments, that they could be held at the same time.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. All right. So I want to talk about when you're in the middle of grief or when you're in the middle of experiencing whatever it is you're experiencing and someone says to you, it's not that bad, let it go, move on, gratitude. They say things that are absolutely well-meaning, but are actually violating our space and our boundaries and our process.
Mm-hmm.
What do you recommend that people say? Or how do you structure your boundaries so that you can support yourself in your grieving without allowing other people to take over?
So, yeah, there's a few pieces to that. I experienced that quite a bit, actually, particularly with my mother, who I think she was also grieving. I mean, I don't think this. I know she was also grieving because she was looking forward to being a grandmother, and she had a lot of grief about that not coming to fruition. And I think my mom is a conflict avoidant person, but she's also a very poorly boundaried empath. She's working on it, and she knows that. But I think what happens is that when she feels a feeling that is so big, sometimes she's really good at stepping in and holding that feeling, but she can also sometimes do the like, here's a cookie, like literally will give you a cookie because she's like an amazing baker.
Okay, so you can ship all of those cookies to me.
Yeah.
Cookies are my favorite thing in the whole entire world, preferably chocolate chip.
She makes a bomb-ass gluten-free chocolate chip cookie. It's like amazing.
Okay, bring that over then, Andi. Bring it over.
So there was, definitely a lot of, because I got married this year. And it was interesting because I got married actually from a place of acknowledging grief, because what it was that my partner and I both ended up in the hospital this year for different reasons, and we wanted to be each other's person. And we have an intention to have like a more sort of spiritual, magical, like wedding type of thing that will actually be more for us, like what is the significant thing. The piece of paper feels significant to us, but it actually in some ways is more like, I want this person to be my person in the hospital. But what would happen is my mom would say, but you got married this year. And I'd be like, yeah, and every other part of my life is fucked. And I don't understand why you can't see that. And it was really, so I struggled with that in a big way. And I think that there's kind of, so the one piece is that you can name it directly back. You can just name back like, yes, this other piece is true, and I can feel both these feelings at the same time. And I also really strongly believe that our boundaries, we need to be accountable for our own boundaries. And where I got introduced to that concept was from, there's a teacher who I did a boundary course with named Pavani More, who is wonderful. Is like a wonderful, wonderful academic and sex therapist. And I love Pavani's work. And they did a class on boundaries where they talked about how we need to be accountable for setting our own boundaries, because if we make our boundaries something that are like sort of being held by someone else, we don't actually have the power to enforce them ourselves. And so we have no guarantee that they'll actually happen. So I think when that's happened for me, what I've done is I've named it directly and seen if the person is receptive to hearing that. And if the person isn't receptive to hearing that, I take space from them. And I don't think you have to take space. Like, I really believe that I used to be a person who, if something happened and it didn't feel good, I would sort of do the trauma-driven, like, you're out, I'm not talking to you anymore. But invariably that wouldn't end up working, because I like have this loyal Leo heart, and I would end up missing the person or needing to share community space with the person or whatever. There was some reason that, like, saying, fuck this, we actually aren't going to talk, like, really wasn't workable. And so now what I've kind of been working with, and my partner and I talk about this a lot, is to keep people as close as the relationship is nourishing to you. So keep close to you the pieces that work. So for example, like, one of my exes, we don't get along on many things. I got a car recently, first time I ever got a new car, and I knew that of almost all the people in my life, he would want to test drive it. So I messaged him and I said, you got to come to my house, you got to test drive this car, you know? And I don't talk to him about the other parts of my life because it's not helpful, but I can keep him close for that piece. And I think if you're grieving, it's like, it actually really matters who you keep close with you in your grief time, because those people are going to function basically like doulas for you. You know, like, they're helping you walk through, like, because grief is like a state of, like, almost being between the veils, you know, like you're touching death really closely. And the people who are going to be close with you in that, like, that is a really intimate thing. And it's okay to say, you know what, like, I think you're just not in a place where you want to hold this in the way that I need, and maybe I need to grieve that and just take some space with you and reconnect with you in the ways that make sense. And maybe the ways of us reconnecting is to not connect at all if there is nothing nourishing left, or maybe it's just on these particular things or just in this particular way. And in that way, I think we can kind of step out of treating our relationships and our community networks as disposable, while also not expecting things from people that they can't give, and continually being hurt and feeling like we're not honoring our boundaries.
Yes, absolutely. I so appreciate that. I really appreciate your vulnerability and your storytelling, and I congratulate you, I guess. Is that what I say? I don't know, but happy 1 year.
Yeah.
Cycle.
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. I'm actually, it's been a weird ride. And yeah, I think that if the congratulating functions as an acknowledgement,
yeah,
I can hold that landing in a good way in my heart, because yeah, it is actually something a lot of people want to turn away from, including me. Yeah. Like, including me in moments.
Totally. All right, Andi, do you have any final thoughts on grief?
Yeah, I think my only final thought is that I really, and I will say it is a product plug, but and I'm going to do it shamelessly because it's a really good product, is that my zine Soother really does show a really beautiful collection of art and magic and writing, people just really processing grief about what family and fertility is for them. And I think that if you're in a process of grieving, or you're wanting to sort of figure out what the art of grieving is, and you want to kind of have access to doing that really affordably, that gives you access to a bunch of different people's stories and strategies, like, I'd highly recommend downloading it. The most common piece of feedback that I get about it is that it makes people cry like a couple minutes in. I'm really proud of that collection, and yeah, I'd highly recommend it.
Sounds good. I will make sure to add that to the show notes for all of you listening, so that you can get easy access to Andi's zine Soother. Thank you so much, Andi, for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciated getting to talk to you. This is not what I thought I was going to end up talking about, but it's so appropriate and
so
nourishing. Good. It feels really good. Thank you.
Andi and I had a lot of thoughts around grief, and now we want to hear yours. Come hang out with us on Instagram and Facebook. You can find Andi at Witch Cabinet and me at I Am Thais Sky. And if you want to learn more about Andi's work, go to www.witchcabinet.com. And as always, you can learn more about me and my work at www.thaissky.com. See you next week.